This is the last part of the real-time chat application where we'll be building the front end with NextJS and Typescript. And just like I showed you in the previous videos, we have a homepage where we can create and display the rooms. So if we create a room and call it NextJS, the user will be able to join the room by clicking the button, and this will establish a WebSocket connection, which then the user can send and receive messages through. And I have a separate incognito page where I'll be logging in with a different user and join the same room that we created, and that will lead us to the app page /app page here we have, where we can then send random messages through this WebSocket connection, which then the other user can receive with a message saying that a user has joined the room and those random messages like that. And before I continue, I'd like to give a shout out to Nico Nako, which is a repository where I refer to a lot of this stuff from. And let's start with an overview of what we'll be working on today. We'll be building the login homepage and the app page, as well as the auth context provider and the WebSocket provider using the create context method from React. So here's a big picture on how this is going to look. We first have the auth context provider that has the authenticated and the user states that will be shared across different pages, as well as the WebSocket provider that shares the connection across different pages. So for instance, we can set connection using the WebSocket from the homepage and share that connection across the app page, which can then use the connection to send and receive messages accordingly. And now that we have in mind what we need to do, I want to create our Next.js app. And there's a documentation on Tailwind CSS, which we'll be using in this application, that walks you through how you can create your Next.js app with Typescript and also install Tailwind CSS. So inside the parent directory where I have the server directory, I'm going to do npx create next app and call it client with the TypeScript and ESLint options and let it load. And once that has been installed, we can see we have everything we need inside the client directory. So the next thing I would do is cd into this directory and do npm install Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. And once that's done, I'm going to do npx Tailwind CSS init-p, which will then create this Tailwind config file here. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy these lines here under content. So I'll paste that and also have some colors labels here, which I'll add under theme so that I can use these texts when I color texts or backgrounds. And the next thing I want to do is add these 3 lines to styles/global CSS. So I'll come to styles global CSS and get rid of everything in here and paste those 3 lines in there. And then go into pages index.tsx, where I'll get rid of everything inside here and create my React component. And I'm creating that React component using the VS Code extension called React Snippet. So if you don't have that, you can install that on your VS Code. That way you can just type RAFCE to create your React arrow function export component. And just to see if our app is working, I'll just add an h1 tag, say hello. And inside here, I'm just going to do npm run dev. And let's try to access localhost 3000 on the browser. And we can see the hello message being displayed, so we know that Next app is working. The first thing I will do here is actually add some styling in the root. So I'll add some empty tags where I'll put the component inside, as well as a div tag that will be wrapping the component. And I want to add some styling inside this div. such as the flex box, flex column, but flex row when it hits the breakpoint. And I want to set the height as well as the minimum height, the font, and then save that. And the first page I want to work on is the login page. So under the pages directory, I will create the login directory and the index.tsx file there. And again, I will create the React component. So here I want to have a parent div that's gonna wrap everything around, as well as a form that will have the input tag for the email and for the password, as well as a button for login. And under the first input tag, I will have a placeholder for the email, as well as some styling, which I'll just type out here without too much explanation due to time constraint. But I'm just adding this border, as well as what happens when you actually click on the input tag. So I'll do border blue, and this outline none is necessary so that you override the default styling. And I will pretty much copy this here for the password tag, but here I want to make sure I mention that this is of type password, and the placeholder will be password, and the styling will be the same except for margin top, which I'll keep it at 4. And then for the form, I also want to add some styling for flexbox and set the width to be maybe 1/5 of the screen, as well as some styling for the parent div for flexbox, item center, justify center, set the minimum width as well as the minimum height. So when we go into the login page, this is what we see, because I actually forgot to put border here. Actually, I will do border 2 and the same here. And let's style the button as well while we're here. So I'll add some padding and margin, blue background, and white text. Save that. And actually another typo here. There are 2 border here, so I need to get rid of that. Save it. And we can see the input fields for the email and password, as well as the login button. And I actually want to add a welcome message, which I'll just paste inside this form for the first input, which I'll just paste here to save some time. As you can see, we see a welcome message with the input fields and the login button. And the next thing we want to do is fetch the login API. So in order to do that, we need to read the values from the input fields and send it to the backend. And in order to do that, we need the useState hook from React. And using that, we're going to create 2 states, one for the email with a default value of empty string, as well as password. And then under each of the input, we can set the value to be email. And on change, meaning on every keystroke, we can use the set email setter to set the value of the email using the target.value. And we can do the same thing for the password. So on change, we read the target value of the event to set the password. And on click of this button, which I actually want to set the type for as well. So the type will be submit. And on click, we want to invoke the submit handler, which I will create above here. So we create a submit handler as such that receives an event. And the type of this event will be synthetic event. And this will be asynchronous because we want to call the endpoint using the fetch function, which we will have to call with await. But here I first want to do prevent default on this event and add a try catch block where I'll just log the error if there is one. And inside this try block, I'll do await fetch on the API, which I'll describe here. And this fetch function will return us the response. I'll save that. And as the first parameter for the fetch function, we want to pass in the URL of the API, which we will define on a separate file. So inside the client directory, I'm going to create constants.index.ts. And inside this file, I will create this variable called API_URL, which will be localhost at port 8080 by default, which is where our backend is running on. So I'll save that. That way I can import API URL from constants. And then inside the fetch function, instead of single quote, I'll do this tick so that I can use the API URL variable and do /login. And as its argument, I'll specify the request method headers. As well as the body, which I'll use the json.stringify and pass in the email as well as the password state. And we can read the data using the JSON function on the response, which we have to call on await, and this will return us the data. And if the response is status OK, then we can create this user object with username and ID and store it inside our local storage. And just for your information, this is not the best practice, but we'll be just saving this in the local storage and accessing it from the auth context provider or our React context to pass the data around. The reason for doing this is to have our application working for now, and I'll be adding the changes in the future in my GitHub repository, so please refer to that if you like. But for now, this will do the job that we need. And once we save the user information in the local storage, we want to redirect the user to the home page. So here I want to do router.push to the home page. And this router, we are going to call it from next router, but we need to call the use router from next/router and define our router with that use router here. And the next thing I want to do is create the auth context provider, which will help us maintain our user information across different pages and also redirect the user if the user information is not stored in the local storage. So under the client directory, I'm going to create the modules directory and create the auth provider.tsx file. So here I will create the React component, which I'll name as auth context provider. And this will receive a children where its type would be react.react node. And if you remember from the diagram earlier, Auth context provider keeps tracks of some of the states. So we would have an authenticated Boolean state, which will be false by default, as well as the user state, where we would actually define the type to be user info, which I'll define right up here. So I'll do export type user info, where username will be string and the ID will be string as well. So let me save that. And I actually want to call this type from the login page earlier so that I can define this user here. And I will import that from the modules like that. So back in the Auth context provider, in order to pass these states down to its children components, we want to create context, name it Auth context, using the React's create context method. So up here, I will import create context, and I will define the authenticated state, which I'll give its default value to be false. Set authenticated, which will be a function. A user, which will have a username with an empty string, an ID that's of empty string. And I actually want to give its default value here as well. So it'll be an empty string for both the username and the ID. And set user will be a function as well. And I need to provide the type definition here as well, which I'll just paste to save some time. And then what we want to return from this auth context provider is actually our auth context dot provider, which will have its children and the value that we want to pass down, which would be 4 of these states that we defined right here. And now we want to add the main logic to handle and maintain these states. And in order to do that, I would have use effect, and I'll also need the use router from next/router. So here I would define my router, and the use effect function that will have its dependency array containing the authenticated Boolean. And inside here, let me just paste what I already have to save some time. But here, what I'm doing is calling or getting the user information from the local storage. And if there is no user information, we want to redirect the user to the login page. But one exception would be when we are in the signup page. And if there is actually a user information in the local storage, we want to set the user state information, which is the user state here, using the setter, and also set the authenticated to be true so that we can make use of the authenticated and the user states in other components. But in order to make that happen, we actually have to wrap everything around this auth context provider. So I would go into _app.tsx here and import the auth context provider from the modules and wrap everything around here, auth context provider. And save it. This way we are sharing our states inside the auth provider such as the authenticated and the user, down to its children, which is the components here under the root. And now that we have the auth context provider in place, there is a few more things that I have to add inside the login page. So I would import the auth context and also the use context hook from React, so that down here I can call the authenticated boolean using the context, using the auth context. I actually need use effect here as well. And I want to add a simple use effect function here, so that if the user is authenticated already, we would want to redirect your user to the home page. So that does what we need to log in and share the user information across different pages. Let's now move on to the home page. So inside the index.tsx, I actually want to get rid of this hello message. And I first want to work on the part where we can create a room. So I'll have a parent div, and inside this div, I want to create another div that contains an input field where we can enter the room name, as well as a button that will allow us to create our room. So under this input, the type will be text, and I would have some styling here, and I'll have a placeholder saying room name, and I'll just paste some styling that I already have to save some time. And same for the button, I'll paste some styling that I have created. So inside this parent div here, I want to make it flexbox and justify center with some margin on top and padding. And inside this parent div, I want to add some margin, padding, define the height and the width. Let's save this and see how it looks on the browser. So when I go to the home page, we can see the input field as well as the button created here. And on this page, we also want to display the rooms that we created. So in order to keep track of the rooms that we have, we would need a useState hook, which will have a rooms, and this will be an array of rooms with an ID as well as the name. So make sure to add an array here. And to display some of these rooms, I want to create some placeholder rooms with a random ID and a random name. So right below this parent div here, I'll actually paste this like this and save it to show how it looks. So we have some boxes that show the room name as well as the join button here. So to give you an idea on how this looks, we have a parent div with margin and a text saying available rooms. And inside this div, we are looping through the rooms using the JavaScript map function, where we have a div with a key and an index that's from mapping through each of the rooms that has a border of color blue and wraps around these content here. And it displays the room name, and we would use the ID of this room later when we need to join a room. But first, let's add some logic to fetch the create room endpoint so that we can create a room using this input and a button. So here I would create a state, call it room name, with a default value of empty string. And down here under input tag, just like how we did for the login, I'll set the value to be room name. And on change, I'll set the room name using the target value. And when the user clicks this button, that's going to invoke the submit handler, which we'll define up here. And I'll just paste the logic here since it's very similar to fetching the login API. But just remember to specify the type of the event here. And make sure this is asynchronous. I would also need to import this API URL. So I would import API URL from constants. And in order to create the ID of the room, I'm making use of this UUID v4, which I'll have to install by doing npm install UUID. And then I would import that from here, v4 as UUID v4 from UUID. But you'll see how this still throws an error, so we actually have to run this to add the type declaration. So I'll paste that there. And once that's done, I'll save it. And now the error is gone. But here I also want to create a function to get the rooms if the response is okay. Because once we create the room by calling this endpoint, we want to update the rooms that we have. So right up here, I will just paste that there again. So we would hit the get rooms endpoint where we would then save the data and set it as rooms. So I'll get rid of this placeholder because we don't need this anymore. On top of that, we actually need to use the use effect to make sure that we have the rooms updated. So I'll call this use effect that has an empty dependency array that would call the get rooms function. That way we can make sure that the rooms are always up to date. And let's run our application on the browser just to make sure everything's working. And before we run the server, there's actually a very important step that we have to add to the server to resolve the CORS policy error. And in case you're not too familiar, the CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. So if we are trying to access the backend from a different origin, in our case, we're accessing it from localhost 3000 and not from its origin, which is port 8080. This would throw a CORS policy error, which prevents other origins from accessing this port. So inside our Golang router, we actually want to use this CORS package to allow origins from localhost 3000. So if I try to save this, the VS Code will import this package, but we don't have it installed, so we have to cd into server and do go mod tidy. So I will save that again, and that will have the CORS handled. And now we can do go run cmd main.go. And if we try to create a room, let's say NextJS, we can see the room being displayed, and we can just create as many rooms as we would like. So we can create room and get rooms as intended. The next thing we want to do on the homepage is the join room. And the join room endpoint is what will establish the WebSocket connection on the front end. So right here in the join button, I'll define a onClick, which will call the join room function, where I'll pass in the room ID. And up here, I want to add this join room method that accepts a room ID. And here I'll create a WebSocket object using new WebSocket that will accept the WebSocket URL, which I will again define in a separate file that I created earlier. So here I would add the WebSocket URL that is running on localhost port 8080 on the WebSocket protocol. So I'll save that and just import that here. Import WebSocket URL from constants. And down here, I can call the WebSocket URL. And the path that we had defined is ws/joinroom/room ID that we are receiving through the parameter here. But we also need to pass in the user ID, which we will be getting from the auth context provider. So in order to use the context, I will call the use context hook from React and the auth context from the auth provider. So I can call user using the use context by calling the auth context. That way we can use the user state here. And we can also define the username by calling user.username. And if this WebSocket is actually established and it's open, we can set this connection like this. But if you remember from the diagram, we actually have to define this in our WebSocket provider. So just like how we did for the auth context provider, I will create a file under the modules, call it WebSocket provider.tsx, and I will just paste this code here because it's very similar to the authentication provider that we created earlier. So just like how we did before, we create the states for the connection where the type will be con, which is of type WebSocket or null. And we would define this WebSocket context using create context, where we have the connection and the set connection defined, which will then pass down to the children here. So it's much more simple than the authentication provider. And now that we have defined this here, we shouldn't forget to add this in the root. So here I'll call WebSocket provider from module/WebSocket provider, and then wrap this here with the WebSocket provider like this and save it. That way, back in the home page, we can call this WebSocket context from module/WebSocket provider, or this S with a small letter S, and then call this set connection setter using the use context on the WebSocket context. So down here we can set the connection using this WebSocket that we created, And then we want to redirect your user to the app page. But in order to do that, again, we have to define this router. Down here, I will just import use router and define my router here. And let's test if this WebSocket connection can be established. So in order to do that, I actually want to create a app page. So here, let's just create an app page saying app page like this. So I just saved it. And back in the browser, we would click join, and we can see how that was redirected to the app page. So that means the WebSocket connection was indeed established, and that join room endpoint is working as intended. So now that we have everything we need on the home page, we can now work on the app page. So here, I'll paste what I already have and save it and show you how that looks. So I'll go into the app page. And this gives us a text area as well as a button inside this gray background. So we have a text area that's defined inside a div, and we have a parent div that contains this text area div as well as a button and just some overlaying div tags that wraps around the entire thing. And then we would want to display the messages that we send and receive up here. So we'll be creating a chat body component for that. But before we create that component, we actually want to handle some messages from this app page. So we would be using useState to keep track of the messages state. So we would call this set messages. And this will be an array of message objects, which I will define right up here. So this message will have a content of string type, a client ID, a username, room ID, as well as the type of the message, which will either be receive or self. And I want to create some default messages so that I can display the messages before I actually receive them through the WebSocket connection. So what we're going to do with these messages is actually pass this down to the chat body component that we will be creating. So inside here, we'll have a div and a chat body component, which will pass the messages as its data. So we want to create this chat body component inside the components directory. So here I would create chatbody.tsx like this. Call it chat body, and this will receive the data, where data will be array of messages. And I would need to import this message type from the app pages. So it'll be pages/app. And inside this component, I'll have an empty tag, and I'll be mapping through this data where each element will be the message itself as well as the index. And we will return slightly different components based on the type of the message. So if the type is received, we will return a component, else we'll return a different component. So again, I'll paste some code here. So as you can see, we'll return a component where the background is blue and the text is white when the message type is actually self. And otherwise, we will return a component where the background is gray with dark text. So let's save this, come back to the app page, and now we have to import this component. So I would import chat body from components / chat body, save that. And as you can see on the app page, it displays the placeholder messages as intended. But we forgot to add some padding here, so let's go and add that real quick. So here I would add some styling, such as the padding, margin, like this. And now it's a little bit better. So now we're coming close to the end. We just have to send the message and receive it through the WebSocket connection. So now let's try to send the message through this WebSocket connection. So on this send button, I'll add this on click and a send message method here. And up here, I'll create this send message method like this. But in order to send the message, we actually need the value from the text area. So in order to use that value from the text area, I would use this useRef hook from React, and then actually get rid of these placeholders here for the messages, and define my text area reference. And I will define this type a little bit later. But then down here inside the text area tag, I would create this reference and add the text area reference there. And this actually gives us the type of this text area element. So I'll just copy this here and paste it as its type. And with this reference, we can now reference the value inside the text area using the text area.current.value. So if this doesn't exist, we would just return, but this could actually be null, so I'll add this here. And I also want to check if the connection is still there. So in order to check the connection, we have to call the connection from the WebSocket context again. So I'll call WebSocket context from the WebSocket provider, and I also need to call the use context provider or the hook from React. That way I can call the connection using the use context and calling the WebSocket context. And we also need to redirect the user. So I would again call the use router from the next router and just call it here. Router equals to use router. So inside the send message method, if we don't have the connection, we want to redirect the user to the home page. And if that's not the case, we can then send the value inside the text area over this connection. And then we would want to set this value back to the empty string, and we can save that. And when I save, the text area reference gives me an error, and that's because I didn't give it a default value. And that only does the sending of the message. There are two more things that we have to add here, and we will be using the useEffect hook to do that. So the first thing we need to do is use the useEffect hook to get clients in the room. So I'll just add this here. And the second one we have to do is handle WebSocket connection. So if we receive any message, then we would have to handle it and display it accordingly. So that's what the second useEffect will do. And the first useEffect will make sure we have all the clients in the room up to date. And due to time constraint, I'll copy and paste the code here, just like how we did before. So let's import what we need before explaining how that works. So I'll just import API URL from constants. And down here, I also need the set users. And this is something we actually have to define here. So here I'll create the users state and the set users that keeps tracks of the users that's inside this chat. So this will be an array, and this will be an array of object containing username for now. So let me save that and kind of go over what this does. So it checks if the WebSocket connection is alive, then it would retrieve the room ID from the WebSocket connection URL. And then we define this getUser asynchronous function, which we call down here. And the reason for doing this is because we need to call the fetch function, which requires the function to be asynchronous, but we cannot make this function inside the useEffect to be asynchronous. So we just have to define a separate asynchronous function and then call it inside the useEffect. And we're just calling the getClients endpoint that we created in the earlier part using the getRequest and just using the data from the response to just set the users here. I don't need this log information here, so I'll just get rid of that. So that is the part for managing the clients in the room. Now let's move on to the actual last part, which will handle the WebSocket connection. So this depends on many different states, such as text area, messages, connections, and the users. So here I want to use this auto size package. So I want to pause this real quick and install auto size and import auto size from auto size. And if it throws an error, again, we can copy this from here, paste it. And down here inside the second useEffect, if we have text area value, we would use the auto size to resize the text area. And again, we would check if the connection is alive. If that's not the case, we would redirect the user to the home page. And there are 4 different states of the connection that we can check inside this useEffect. First, we have the on message. And then we have on close, which we won't be handling in this tutorial since we just want to work on the on message, which is the most important part here. We also have connection on open. But as I said, I'll just leave them here and add if needed in the future. For now, what we need is some logic inside the on message to handle the messages that we receive from the backend. So here we want to parse the message and store it inside the variable that we define. We call it M. And if we get a message saying a new user has joined the room, we would add these users to the existing users. So you can do that by calling these existing users and just adding the username here. So if you remember on the backend, let's go to the server, internal WebSocket handler. When a new user has joined, we send a message saying that a new user has joined the room. So if we get that as our message, we are just adding these users to our users list. And if we get a message saying that a user left the chat, which is a message on the backend that we defined when we actually unregisters a user, we actually broadcast a message saying that user has left the chat. So if that's the case, we would filter all the user for the user that has the username that's not equal to this username, and just set these users, and also set messages in here. So that I display this message, user left the chat, inside the chat room. But this is optional. And we want to set the type of the message so that we display the messages accordingly on whether it's received from the other user or it's from the self. So we can use the ternary operator to check if the username of the logged in user is the same as the message username, and determine if the type of the message is self or it's received. There's a typo here. This should be a colon. And I actually need to import this user from the Auth context provider. So I will import Auth context from modules/auth provider. Call this user using the use context like this. That way we can check the user information here. And lastly, we would set the messages as such. Of course, there's a typo here again, and save that like that. So that pretty much does everything we need to handle the message that we receive through the WebSocket connection. So the last thing we would do is to confirm that everything is working as intended. So let's restart the server by running go run cmd main.go and our client using npm run dev. Open it up on the browser, and I'll also have a separate incognito page where I will be logging in with a different user. So let's just create this room like this. And if we refresh, we can see that the room's being displayed and user 1 can join and the user 2 can also join. And when a new user has joined the room, it will display how the new user has joined the room. And if I type a message here and send it across, the other user will receive. And let's just confirm that user 2 can also send a message here. Actually, this also should say which user has sent the message, but I think there is a tiny bug there. But everything is pretty much working as intended. So as long as we can create the rooms, get the rooms, and communicate over that WebSocket connection, I think we should be happy with that. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this video is not comprehensive, especially with the authentication. I'm storing user information in the local storage, and it is not the best practice, but I'll make some changes in the future and add it to the GitHub repository. So make sure to check it out later. But that wraps up everything I wanted to cover in this video. If you have any question, feel free to comment down below. Thank you all for your time and watching this video.